Hello, Buddhas. Today we are going to talk about how the story of evolution is always evolving. Now, Buddhas, before we get started, I've got to let you know that I've got a playlist down below with well over 150 Buddha Billionaire videos that you can binge watch to accelerate your spiritual awakening. Now, what do I mean by the story of evolution? Well, for this context, and because of how I was brought up in a Western civilization, the easiest thing for me to look at is something like the Bible. In the Bible, there are multiple stories that are all been kind of thrown together by some Roman people, apparently, and were said, hey, here's the book that you gotta read and know. Those stories weren't just written by some random dude who was like, hi, I'm gonna make a control mechanism for Western civilization. These were stories that have been a part of humanity for longer than we recognize that humanity has actually been a thing. And the fascinating thing to me about how I've started to research and to understand and to learn through the Neville Goddards and the reality transurfings and the different techniques is that the stories in the Bible themselves are actually all very much that same repeating pattern of recognizing, becoming, and then moving on to that next stage. Starting in Genesis, going through Jesus, the letters of Paul, all these different levels are actually building off of that same fundamental concept of the evolution of consciousness. And consciousness itself is not necessarily what's going on in your head or outside of your head, but it's the essence of beingness. One could argue that a rock has consciousness, a very, very fundamental consciousness, but as a thing that exists, it has its own self-identification. If you were to ask it in some way of having the way to communicate with a rock, it would say, I am rock. Kind of like I am Groot from all of the Marvel movies. That's not an accident. Groot is actually extremely, extremely metaphysical. So the I am rock state goes from I am rock to I am now water, to I am now land and life and vegetation and humans. Well, there's a whole animal section between there that I skipped, but you get the point. It's an evolution of very, very basic, dense, hard matter into less basic, well, I mean, pretty basic, but more complicated than a rock if you were to objectively look at it from a human perspective. But my body is entirely made up of bits and pieces that have been on this planet for longer than I can even comprehend. So am I not just a rock walking around? It's when you start to take that perspective that this is all connected, you can start to see that the journey, the joy, the pleasure of thinking about evolution itself as a whole is actually getting more and more complicated the more and more complicated that we become. And to bring this all back to the whole point of why I'm making this video is this. When the first parts of something like, and it doesn't have to just be the Bible, but something like the Bible, when the first aspects of that are being written, let's say Genesis sentences 1 through 7, like the first main set of there was light and darkness and it was good kind of deal, like that really basic stuff is the fundamental kind of foundation. The next set builds on that. The set after that builds on that. The stories are a continuation and a more complex divergence of an infinitely repeating pattern. And what's so much fun about starting to recognize that is that also recognize the level of consciousness of the people who wrote those initial words. What they were trying to do, again, was not necessarily instill a control mechanism on humanity, but to actually show humanity where they came from and what consciousness is and how to evolve. And then that has gotten more complicated over time. And that has had more information piled onto it over time. And there's nothing right or wrong about that. It just is how things have gone. And this keeps going back to the same fundamental piece of magic that I am starting to discover in this form of literature, and that is the same simple basic story keeps happening. And that's what we're here to discover within ourselves, that our imagination is what and ultimately creates our reality. Jesus Christ is the imagination of humanity. You can think of it as human history, or you can think of it as secular history or whatever, but if I were to walk around and say, this is a Lululemon, people would be like, oh my God, what's a Lululemon? But if it were to stick, people would eventually associate any long sleeve fitness shirt as a Lululemon, not a shirt. The word shirt could be entirely removed from the English vocabulary if I called these Lululemons all the time. We see this with cultures all over the place, where in Britain they'll call it a boot, and in Canada we think a boot is a question, whereas it's a trunk. So these language words mean the same thing, but have totally different letters and combinations and sounds. So for someone to take an objective look at something like the Bible, as I have started to try to do in my life, and it's so exciting and fascinating, when you start to look at that basic story of Genesis, and how that story of Genesis evolves into a story of the Abrahamic and the Moseses and then the Joshuas and all these states of being, these levels of understanding. When you start to examine it more in that light, the whole world starts to open up to you. So Buddhas, what I am recommending here is to have the most possible open mind that you can have at any point while you are reading absolutely anything. Because every single thing is telling the same story. They're all talking about the story of evolution and human conscious development. And I don't specifically just mean the Bible. I mean everything, every story, all of the time. So Buddhas, if you thought this was helpful, please share with anyone that you think you could add this to. Send them that playlist so you can help accelerate their spiritual journey as well. And remember, Buddhas, after liking, commenting, subscribing, the most important thing is to love yourself.